The controversial topic of counting votes, the court will rule on whether votes counted at constituency level will be final. The IEBC has appealed against the ruling by High Court that such votes announced by the returning officers at constituency be declared as final. Our political reporter Murimi Mwangi now joins us live from our City Centre studio to talk about this particular issue. Murimi, thank you very much for joining us here on the show. Now, this is really one of the big issues that we're talking about in the country. First of all, you could just juggle our memories about the kind of arguments that were brought forward at that time when different parties were bringing up their submissions before the Court of Appeal.
Well, good morning, Betty. Tomorrow marks a big day for the Kenyan judiciary, the political class, as well as the top presidential contenders in regard to the finality of presidential results announced by the 290 constituency returning officers. Tomorrow, the court, the five-judge bench of the appellate court, will give a verdict as to if results announced at the constituency level should be subject to any further verification. Remember, IEBC is seeking powers to verify that at the National Tallying Center. That, of course, coming after the April 7th High Court verdict that declared results at the constituency level as final and not subject to any further verification. And the position of the High Court as at the time was that any questions with regard to the finality of any of the presidential results from the 290 constituencies could only happen through the election court, in this case for the presidential election being the Supreme Court. But of course, before the Court of Appeal, the IEBC has argued that that ruling occasioned an illegitimate interpretation of the law, which, according to them, occasioned an illegitimate amendment to the Constitution, because for them, for the IEBC, they insist that the Constitution ensconces a position where the chairperson of the IEBC is the de facto returning officer for the purpose of the presidential election. And therefore, by delegating that power to the 290 constituency returning officers, the IEBC argues that the High Court had given a leeway for an illegitimate amendment to the Constitution. But of course, the three petitioners at the High Court, who in this case are the respondents, that's Helef Khalifa, Maina Kiai, as well as Tirop Kitur, they argue that what they sought from the court was an interpretation of the law, and that their move to the High Court and the ultimate decision of the High Court in a way safeguards against the tradition of alteration of results announced at the constituency level before they get to the National Tallying Center. And therefore, it is going to be an interesting time for the five-judge bench of the Court of Appeal. But Betty, perhaps one thing is for sure, judging from the political interest drawn to this particular case, that a subsequent appeal before the Supreme Court could be inevitable whichever way the judgment goes tomorrow. Betty.
The timelines, really, how hell-bent is IEBC and even the opposition on ensuring that this ruling actually goes their way? Are we likely to see this? And what would be the implication of having this going to the Supreme Court with just 46 days to the election?
Well, one of the arguments that I picked from the IEBC before the Court of Appeal was their argument that by delegating the powers to the 290 constituency returning officers, that there was a loophole for the potential of 290 different disputes on the finality of results from the constituencies, and that, they argue, would in a way translate to 290 different petitions before the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court only has 14 days to dispose of any presidential election petition as per the law. But of course, the petitioners before the High Court, who are the respondents here, including the Kenyan opposition, the National Super Alliance, which has been enjoined as an interested party in that particular case, they argue that that particular argument is out of place, according to them, because the powers to verify, which the IEBC is seeking to have at the national level, can be exercised by the constituency returning officers. And therefore, by so doing, that would forestall questions on the credibility of results from the constituencies, so that when they get to the National Tallying Center, all that the IEBC chairperson has to do, in fact, according to Senior Counsel James Ore, Mrengo is to just declare the winner without doing much of verification of results from the constituencies, because the position of the High Court was that that can only happen through a petition before the election court, in this case being the Supreme Court. But there was a very interesting discourse from the Office of the Attorney General, which is also one of the respondents in that particular appeal before the Court of Appeal, that the whole petition that was before the High Court, according to Professor Githu Muigai, was one that was based on a political question which was sneaked into the judicial benches as a constitutional query, and therefore he, alongside the IEBC, wanted the Court of Appeal to, of course, overturn the position of the High Court. But besides that, Betty, there was also a very interesting argument by the IEBC that Maina Kiai, who was one of the petitioners before the High Court, was one of the parties who had been enjoined in the 2013 presidential election petition by former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. And therefore, according to them, they argue that the matters that he's seeking interpretation over, or which he was seeking an interpretation from the High Court over, had been subject to that presidential election petition of 2013. And therefore, they want the court to declare that as res judicata, whatever they term as matters that have been disposed of by court, which is at some point one of the petitioners or one of the parties is trying to reintroduce them through the present case, which is before the Court of Appeal. And therefore, it is an interesting time for the Kenyan judiciary, given that we are less than 2 months into the election, and with the high possibility that a presidential election petition could find its way to the Supreme Court. Then the determination of the Court of Appeal now, and possibly even the Supreme Court, if there's a subsequent appeal, could have a great bearing on the 2017 presidential election, Betty.
Thank you very much, Murimi Mwangi. They're reporting from our City Center studio, and he's reporting to us about that much awaited